Well, I'll go ahead and say hi. Welcome, everyone. I'm Christy Roschke. I'm the Managing Director of the News Collab at the Cronkite School at Arizona State University. And for those of you who are joining us for the Innovation Quarter Mediactive course, I'm one of your course instructors. So we're really glad to have you all here today for a really exciting conversation. Before I turn it over to my colleague, Dan Gillmor, I'm going to just make a couple notes, which are, first of all, we are recording this and we'll be making it available later. So just wanted to make sure everyone was aware of that. And then we are welcoming you to ask questions, and we do hope you do, because we'd like to make this as interactive as possible. So you should see a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Those questions will go directly to us as panelists here, and we will be fielding those questions, and as we think it's time to chime in, we'll ask the questions to our guest, and we can have that be a really interactive exchange. So again, please don't hold back and feel free to ask questions. And again, thanks for joining us, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to News Collab co-founder Dan Gillmor.
Good afternoon, evening, everybody, morning, late morning, whatever time zone you're in. It's always an adventure to figure that out. I'm really happy to welcome David Fahrenthold to our session today. I've been a big fan of his work for a long time, and I think the timing today is particularly notable to have you here, given the minor events going on in Washington, and I see your byline on a fairly significant story on the latest outcome of the election. Is that the right way to put it?
The latest time we ran the election and Biden won again.
Right, well, the latest same outcome of the election.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, yeah, yeah, he still won. So, so I'm going to just, we have some questions that people sent in on Twitter. We have questions of our own. We do hope that folks who are listening will send questions in while we're talking if things occur to you. But I'm going to ask David just to reflect a little bit on what things are like right now as a political and issue reporter for the Washington Post at this incredible time. You've seen some enormous changes.
Yeah, so I've been at the Post since the year 2000, and I've been on the politics desk in one way or another since 2010. So I've seen, the rise. That's sort of my first day on the job was sort of the day that the Tea Party class of 2010, all those Republicans were elected, and I've been covering politics in that era since. So I've seen a lot of change in politics and also in our paper. When I started, the paper was sort of declining, really started fighting to hang on. Now we're owned by Jeff Bezos, and we've expanded a lot. So this election was so different than 2016, which was even more different than 2012. We had so many people to cover so many things, and I had that feeling yesterday. So I was one of the folks covering the electoral votes, and that we had reporters in every one of the 6 contested capitals. We had reporters following all these different things. And it was a huge effort of people. So I've seen a huge amount of change in politics and at the paper. I think that one of the interesting things that a case study, I guess, in how much things have changed is the last 6 weeks. As Trump did, in this political career of breaking norms and doing unprecedented things, he did probably the most unprecedented and norm-breaking thing he's ever done, which was after he lost to say he didn't lose and lie about it and say that he was, he'd won in a landslide and sort of spin an alternative reality. And I think, think about where we were 5 years ago. Whatever the president said, I think this was something that was sort of like a touchstone or a guideline for political journalism. If the president said something, the assumption was that it was newsworthy, and also implied in that if the president said something, it was probably true. The president would, if it wasn't, that was a big deal. But the default was if the president said something, it was newsworthy, and probably you could assume, at least as a starting point, that it was accurate. We obviously know with President Trump that's not true at all. If he says something, there's really no correlation between it being true and him saying it. And so when he started talking about, these baseless theories of how he'd really won the election, and there were these, all the different permutations of his theory of how he really won the election. You've seen it covered from the beginning and fairly forcefully as lies, as baseless attempts to undermine democracy. And it took us a while, I think, to kind of get the right language for that, because it's so different than anything we'd ever covered before. But I don't think that if you read the Washington Post, or the New York Times or the LA Times, any of the mainstream news outlets over the last 6 weeks, you could have had any doubt about what Trump was doing or whether Trump was telling the truth. And I think I'm pretty proud of that. It's taken us a long time to adjust to this guy who took advantage for a long time of our willingness to print whatever the president said, because the assumption was it was newsworthy and true. That now, when he attacked democracy, when he tried to subvert the results of an election and do it through falsehoods, we covered it in a way that I think if you were a reader of the Washington Post, you understood that. So I think that is a sign of how much we've changed to adjust to him. It took us a long time, and there were probably some mistakes made along the way, but I was happy to see that's how we did it. And his attempts to sort of bend reality. You didn't see people giving into that. Joe Biden won. He's going to be the next president. As much as Trump said that, our stories and others were consistent that Joe Biden won. He was going to be sworn in. There was no sort of bending to Trump's reality that maybe that wasn't going to happen. So I think that's a sign of how much we've adjusted after all this time.
In the 2016 cycle, you were, from my perspective, among the few people in journalism who had understood the reality of who Trump is, and were proceeding as a reporter based on the concept of what's he actually doing, as opposed to just saying, and how does what he's saying square with reality? And your work on the doings of his charitable foundations ended up earning you well-deserved Pulitzer Prize. And I wonder how long it took for your colleagues, from your observations, to pick up on the need to go that direction, to just relentlessly focus on what's actually happening as opposed to what's being said on Twitter.
Well, in some ways, I had an easier job in 2016 than others, and which is that I didn't, and I sort of chose this assignment for this reason. One of the hardest things about covering Trump then was that he didn't have any power. And so he would say, well, I'm going to, build a wall, or I'm going to deport all the undocumented immigrants, or whatever, all these things, these outlandish things he said he was going to do. He would say it, and then you'd wonder, does he know what he's talking about? Does he really mean it? Is there any way to do the thing he's talking about? So much of that reporting, covering him as a candidate, for people who were following him around day to day, was like nailing Jello to the wall, because you weren't sure ever how seriously to take his words. For me, I liked the Trump charity beat because it wasn't about words. It was about money. It was about something concrete. And that's why I chose it and tried to follow that path, was because unlike Donald Trump, money can only be in one place at once. And if you could, it was easier to find and describe how he'd used the money in his charity, or how he'd not given money to charity. But also you could sort of see in those decisions kind of a picture of him. He used, unlike BS or words or whatever, he had money as a finite resource. And so how did he use this finite resource that he had? What did that show about the decisions that he made? So in that way, my job was easier, because I was writing about something that, could only be in one place at once. I think one of the things that really shaped 2016 versus 2020 is that in 2016, there was really not, I think, ever a widespread sense in the political media that Trump could actually win. Now, that was wrong, obviously, and I think we should have seen what was staring us in the face. But from his time in the primaries to his time as a Republican nominee, there was always this sense that he was this doomed candidate. The Republicans were following this doomed, wild candidate down a dark alley, and they were never going to come back. And if people really thought that he was going to win, or had a greater sense of that he might win, I think the coverage might have been different of him. And there might have been more people trying to treat him as somebody who really might get a chance to implement these policies. But I mean, just to give you a sense of how. So on election night 2016, I was one of two people who was supposed to be writing the web story that would post immediately once they'd called the race. And in those situations, obviously, you always pre-write a version of a story for each candidate, so you don't, when they call the race for the candidate, you're not like starting then. So in 2012, I had written one for Mitt Romney, which was, take my word for it, that was an amazing story. It was a really great Romney story that nobody never saw the light of day. And so then this time we were dividing up the responsibilities, and I was like, well, I know Trump really well, so I'll write the Trump one, the Trump wins version. I'm writing that at like 4 PM on election day, thinking like, well, I'll tell my grandchildren someday that I wrote a story proposing that Donald Trump might actually have won the presidency. And that's how ridiculous it seemed then that he actually might win. And of course, at 2 o'clock in the morning that night, we're posting that story up on the web. So I think that, our both sort of trusting our instincts, which were wrong, and also trusting the polls, which were, more ambiguous than maybe we understood they were, led us to view Trump in one way that I think changed the way he was covered as a candidate from the beginning to the end of that race.
Follow up a bit on your approach in 2016, though I will have one quibble first. You said money is a finite resource. I think our central banks around the world are demonstrating that maybe it's not so finite. If in 2016 you were actively asking your readers to help you do your work, and with great success, by having them chime in with facts and figures and things that they knew about that no one person could have found. Have you carried that forward, and how, and have other people on the staff picked up on that and done the same?
I have carried it forward, and that's one of the things that I really learned in 2016 was that, asking people for help. There's two things social media can do for you is very important. Well, three things. One, it can waste your time, but second, the two valuable things it can do for you is it can help you give audiences kind of a way to hold on to the thread of your story. So we know as readers, you're caught in this like tornado of news and social media and opinion and everything else. And I feel like if somebody has grabbed onto my story, I got to give them something to hold on to in between the stories that I publish. And how can I keep them interested, show them the things that I'm doing, give them kind of a thread to follow. So that's one thing. Social media can do that for you. But it also, once you've built that community of people who are interested in the story, you can ask them for help. You can say, I'm trying to figure out this thing. Does anybody know how to get it? And it worked well in 2016, especially well in 2016, because the thing I was interested in was Trump's interactions with other charities or things he bought from charities. And those were often, the charities themselves, the counterparties in those transactions were just regular people out there in the world. And so there were lots of people who knew a little bit. They knew like a little piece of Trump's charitable history that, you could find them that way. It's the stuff I've been doing since 2016, while Trump has been president, has been about Trump's business. So how is his business doing? What conflicts of interest does it create? What is he using the presidency in ways that benefits his business? The number of people who know that universe, sadly, is smaller, because especially in what we've been doing in 2020, which has been about how has Trump used the federal government to funnel federal money into his business. Is that universe of people who know about federal payments to Trump properties is small, but you can still reach them this way, and that has been a real wonderful thing to discover this year. But just as my best example is, okay, the State Department has held big events at Trump properties. When Trump has a meeting with a foreign leader at Mar-a-Lago, the State Department actually pays for that. So we put in a FOIA request, a Freedom of Information Act request to the State Department saying, how much money did you pay Trump properties over the years for all these different events? They gave us nothing. So then we sued them. We sued the State Department under FOIA. And they promised us something. They promised us more than 300 pages and then delivered 2 pages. And they said, well, you'll get the rest after the election. So this is like October, end of September, beginning of October of this year. And I thought, well, we've done all the things you're supposed to. We've tried all the front doors. We even, tried a lawsuit, and the State Department still won't tell us. I think, well, probably the universe of people who would know about these payments that I sued for and can't get, it's got to be small. But I have no other choice. I'm going to ask for help. So I did. I tweeted out, like, look, if, the State Department has, basically screwed us over, reneged on their promise. Like, is there anybody out there who has this stuff? Thinking like, well, the chances are 1 in a million. But there was somebody out there who had the documents I was looking for. And so we got them before the election. We were able to write this story about how when Trump would go to Mar-a-Lago and bring foreign leaders, Mar-a-Lago was secretly charging the government for everything from the flowers to the hotel rooms to the champagne, even down to Trump's own water. When Trump drank a glass of water, they charged the taxpayers $3 for Trump's water. So that's all stuff that I would never have seen if I hadn't sort of asked for help, and somebody that I never would have thought of appeared with the documents.
One suspects there's going to be lots more where that came from.
I hope.
If the Biden administration is a little less tight on releasing information. That's actually a question that seems fair right now. Is the Obama / Biden administration was, until Trump, widely considered in journalism one of the most hostile administrations we've had to journalism. And I'm wondering what people are thinking is likely to happen in a Biden administration when it comes to transparency, freedom of information, use of the Espionage Act, which really was sadly pioneered by Obama and then turned into a regular weapon by Trump. What's the feeling around the newsroom about how things are going to stay the same or change?
It's a great question. I know less of the newsroom since now, just because we haven't been in the newsroom since March.
The newsroom.
Right. I think that the folks who have covered Biden, the people who've covered the Biden campaign and are covering the transition now, mm-hmm. My sense from just sort of being on stories with them is that they are obviously finding, compared to Trump, that there's a huge improvement. That the Biden people are more open. That they're more likely to answer questions. They're probably not as open as we'd like them to be, but they are. This is going to be the story of the Biden administration in so many ways. The bar was set so low, just like how people applaud Biden for not hiring any of his relatives. Like the bar is, that they're responding in ways that Trump people did not, and probably in ways that you can actually rely on, unlike the Trump people. So I think that so far it's been an improvement. You're right that the Obama White House, which I dealt with a little bit, was at times pretty hostile to the press. Not like Trump, but certainly there was not as much transparency as we would like. My sense from them was that was fueled by kind of a sense that they were special. That there was something about Obama and his people that had transcended politics, and they were doing it all a new way. Biden that's not his view of the world. I mean, if you watch Biden at all, he's somebody about restoring the old way of doing things in Washington, whether, I don't know if that means the 90s or the 80s or whatever, but if that's true, that was an era when Washington was much more transparent to journalists. So I'm hoping he brings that part of Washington back.
Okay. I'm going to jump to some of the questions that came in. I followed your lead and asked people on Twitter what they would ask a Washington Post reporter. And I think we'll start with one from your former colleague and boss, Mike Fancher from Seattle. The question is, what would be different if your journalistic mission specifically included being a steward of democratic principles and practices?
I saw that question. I've been thinking about it. I don't think you would have said that about, 5 years ago, before Trump, would we have said that was part of our job? We would have said, well, we tell the truth. We protect the truth, we promulgate the truth, and make sure that people understand the truth, and that's the old adage from Thomas Jefferson: if you could have a government without newspapers, or newspapers without a government, you'd prefer the latter. So that by telling people the truth and letting them know what's going on in the government, that serves democracy and makes democracy possible. I'm not sure we would have said then. It would have sounded grandiose and maybe like taking a side, you know, maybe like sort of advocacy in a way that we didn't do. Now, you know, but I think that was based on a sense that there was a more of a shared, you know, the view that the truth was important and people should tell the truth and follow the truth was pretty widely accepted around Washington. And I think this presidency, where obviously the truth often did not matter to Donald Trump. In fact, he, you know, the falsehood was one of the primary means of his governance, primary tools of his governance. I think, you know, showed us that the thing that we assumed people always wanted, which was the truth, some people didn't want that. And so, you know, hasn't changed, to me, it hasn't changed our view of what we do, you know, that we tell the truth and that's what serves democracy. But it has been kind of a reminder that, like, you know, we have to keep doing that even if there's not universal acclaim or universal even, you know, desire for people, us telling the truth about what's going on.
I'm interested that you used the word advocacy just then. And I want to push back a little bit on this, because I wonder how it can be advocacy to for journalists to put in their mission statement, basically, and in their coverage, the saving of democracy. That feels like something other than advocacy to me, but maybe I'm getting something wrong here.
Well, I mean, it's not that we were against democracy, but just that I think before Trump, there was this sense that, like, you know, covering politics was like covering a football game, you know. We were standing on the side. We were going to tell you what happened. We weren't going to get in the middle of it, you know. We were going to give you the best view and the best understanding of what was happening down on the field. We weren't on the field. We weren't players. We were just watching it. Yeah. But, you know, that assumes that there's one team that, you know, that both teams are following the rules and nobody's like running in the stands and, you know, punching the coach. And so I think that there was no sense that there was a role for us to play in sort of, you know, making everybody else follow the rules or defending the rules. It was just a given that the rules were there and everybody was following them. So to say, you know, our job is to defend democracy and democratic principles, I think it is that is part of our job, but it's not something that we would have seen, you know, as something that as the first job. You know, our first job is to tell the truth and that hope that everybody else understands the value of it.
Fair enough. I mean, as you know, I'm a big fan of the idea that journalists have to be advocates on some things,
sure,
like protecting freedom of expression, like saving the system that lets us do journalism, things like that.
Well, just as an example, yesterday I was supposed to write about these Republicans who were holding basically fake electoral college elections in the states that Trump won, you know, like in Arizona, Georgia, whatever, states where Biden had won, and the Biden electors were having the real electoral contests. The Republicans were sort of getting together to hold fake electoral contests. Now, I don't know how I would have covered that if it had happened 5 years ago. It wouldn't have happened. But, you know, part of that story was like, you know, the second paragraph of that story, after you explain what they did, is like, this doesn't matter. These have no legal force. You know, what they're doing is, you know, these are people, I'm going to tell you right off the bat that, like, what they're doing is meaningless. And I'm not sure I would have maybe, you know, like, you know, to be that explicit about that this has no meaning at all and you shouldn't pay attention to it. You know, I'm not sure I would have done that with a story before the Trump era, but yesterday it felt like it was a really important thing to do.
That prompts me to ask, if it's meaningless, why cover it?
It's a good question. And I struggle with this. I mean, this is sort of like the story equivalent of one thing that I struggle with on social media, which is like, when do you retweet something just to tell people it's wrong? You know, and, you know, is there a harm in spreading something even as you think you're debunking it? So in this case, why did I write the story yesterday? Because the editors told me to. You know, why did we write about it? Because it seemed like it was getting a lot of attention on TV and social media, often because it was happening in kind of public ways. And we thought it was important that people, you know, especially the Electoral College, nobody really knows how it works, that people understood sort of what actually had happened and how meaningless it was, you know, so they wouldn't be mistaken into thinking that something had happened where Donald Trump had actually gotten electoral votes yesterday.
Let me go back to the Twitter thread and bring some questions. Well, it's a little bit related to previous, but I'll ask anyway. The question is, what will the whiplash be like covering a normal administration after 4 years of Trump? Like, are you prepared for normal coverage?
Well, I've been in journalism a long time, so I covered normal more than Trump. But one thing that has been funny is, as Biden has been choosing his cabinet picks, we're doing the same thing we do with every time there's a new president and a new cabinet, sort of vetting them and saying, so what my colleagues wrote a story the other day about. It was about Neera Tanden, the person that Biden has picked to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget, which was like she ran a think tank. The think tank took donations from these people. Basically, here are the record and the connections of these, people to, different institutions that they're bringing with them into government. In 2008, when Obama took over, that kind of story was like, well, of course you're going to vet people. And in 2020. The reaction was anger, like, how could you vet these people? Don't you, like, basically they were angry that we were applying the standard of the pre-Trump era to these people, that if you're going to get this kind of power, we should know what your connections are and we should look at your record. And it's not enough to just not be related to the president, so that's, I think that's the audience may change or the audience may react to that in a different way, but I think we're trying to do this the same way we would do for any administration and not give Biden a pass just because he's not Trump.
So that leads me to ask a question about possible false equivalence. Given that the rampant, consistent insider corruption of the Trump years, it became so normal that most of it never got covered in the first place. And when it did get covered, it was, well, there they go again. And is that going to lead to even what is bound to be, if this is the Trump level of corruption, then Biden even gets to that, will it all be the same? Will it be like, well, Biden therefore must be that?
I mean, we've never been in a situation like this before. Like, as much as we're trying to cover Biden in the way we covered other administrations, we've never been in the situation you described where we're going from this administration that had so many scandals and so many, unqualified people and so much falsehood to one that's trying to be normal, but that Biden's, aggressively normal. That's his pitch. So I don't know quite how we are going to handle it. I don't think we want to, create some sort of false equivalency. Obviously, you have to cover with the scandals that happen. If something happens in Biden's tenure and we think people ought to know about it, it doesn't matter what, if Trump's person was worse, Biden's person is doing it now, so people ought to know about it. So I think there may be some accusations that we're covering it with false equivalency, but the choice before us now is like, do we cover Biden and, and tell people the things they ought to know about him or not? I mean, maybe you could criticize whatever we did under Trump, but I don't think it should shape what we do under Biden, but making us sort of less sensitive to scandal.
That makes complete sense. I guess what I'm getting to is how do you provide context so people understand that something is this way now and that way then. I don't know how I would do it. It feels to me like this is going to be an important problem for journalism in the next 4 years.
One thing that I have been wondering about, and this is not my job, so I don't know what the rules will be, but these Republicans, the 126 House Republicans and 18 state attorneys general, who basically supported Trump's effort to overturn the election, as farcical and as unsuccessful as it was, will that follow them, right? Just to pick a guy that I used to cover in Congress, Bill Huizenga of Michigan, a Republican from like Holland, Michigan, on the west side of the state. I thought of as a relatively moderate person, signs off on this effort to throw out his own state's votes because they voted for the wrong party. Like, does it follow that guy around? Like when he criticizes Biden, in the next year, he proposes something, is that in the second paragraph of any story about him, Huizenga, who supported overturning the 2020 election? I don't know how, like, those people who are so bought into Trump now and were so bought into Trump last week, they're going to want to go back to normal. And I wonder if how will, people who cover them will treat them. I don't honestly know how they'll handle that.
Yeah. I saw today that that McConnell has finally conceded that
Yes.
Biden is president-elect.
Mhm.
I saw that framed as a power struggle between McConnell and Trump for the future of the Republican Party. Does that sound right to you, or is this just early maneuvering?
I mean, I think it is. I do think it is interesting as a sign of, obviously Trump is going to want to have retained power after he leaves office, but I don't think he really has a sense of how irrelevant he might become. Right? When he's gone, he will be gone. He can tweet, but Twitter could delete him. He could make all sorts of pronouncements, but he's not going to have any power or any real path to get back to power for 4 years. So, I can see why McConnell would want to sideline him a little bit, just because he doesn't want to have his party be beholden to some guy out there throwing bombs on Twitter. That said, McConnell acknowledging this only after the Electoral College has formally voted. I mean, it seems like the bare minimum to sort of just acknowledge reality. So maybe it is a fight with Trump, but it's, the fight is sort of on Trump's ground. He already waited basically a month to acknowledge that Biden won.
Speaking of Twitter, they have been for 4 years allowing fairly incendiary and crazy stuff from one customer or user of Twitter under the well-known presidential exception to the rules of Twitter. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think Twitter is going to kick him out?
Oh, we've talked about that internally at the Post, and I mean, he generates a lot of interest and comment, although I would imagine less than he did 4 years ago. He's made Twitter, a worldwide name. Like he's been the best advertisement for Twitter being an important place to be. When he's gone, though, so let's take a case that they don't ban him and they allow him to stay on Twitter. He seems like he's not going to be that important. He's not going to be the guy he is right now because he won't have any power. So will he bring the same kind of traffic and debate to Twitter, or will he just be some guy on Twitter? And if Twitter bans him, it will be interesting to see what happens to Trump, because Twitter is literally with his thumb he can get on television, right? He can be watching television, do something with his thumb, and then 5 minutes later he's on national TV. Still, I mean, I think that's still the case even now. If he loses that and he has to actually make TV appearances or go give speeches or go be on Parler or Facebook or whatever, something where he doesn't have like a direct line to the mainstream media and to TV bookers and other stuff, it'll be interesting to see how his influence changes. I mean, this guy wasn't president. He's not the world's greatest example, but you remember a guy named Milo Yiannopoulos, a name from 2017? He was like the world's greatest Twitter troll. And for months in 2017, people were talking about him. When he'd come give speeches, left-wing protesters would come and like burn the building down. He was this like incredibly important figure. Twitter banned him, and he's gone. You never hear about that guy. I don't know what became of him, but like he vanished. And I think obviously Donald Trump's not going to vanish like that. But if Twitter does ban him, it will really make it, and he can't reach that audience in a second. I think, will really affect the power he has going forward.
Well, speaking of power, and this is getting a little bit divergent from where we started, but I think it's an important question. And you you mentioned that Milo all but disappeared. That's because of the power of a very small number of companies to decide at some fairly significant level who gets to speak publicly to a large audience in this country or around the world. Doesn't that make you at all uncomfortable?
No, it's an interesting question. I don't know. That's probably more into the realm of morality and like other people's rules than I should get into. I don't know enough as a non-tech reporter to really pronounce on that. I'm fascinated to see what they do, but I don't think I should tell them what to do.
All right. Private companies and have the right. My question, and I've been on this kick for a long time, is should there be such a small number of centralized entities that have this much power in the first place? Then
yeah, I agree.
I think that we have difficult issues ahead. Let me pull up another question from our. Actually, we have. Let's get one from our Q&A here. Justin asked, if you probably can see it, what do you think of Biden's strategy post-election of seemingly ignoring Trump's charges or efforts at election fraud rather than engage in the alternative reality this is kind of an opinion of a strategy that you're being asked to give, but does it, do you think it's at least effective, or is it, should he be addressing this?
It was so interesting to watch this because Biden basically, as Trump is trying every possible way to overturn and subvert the election, Biden is basically ignoring him. I mean, there were I think Biden sort of sped up his announcements of cabinet picks. Like Biden was trying to do presidential things to try to sort of step into the void and fill the void, but he wasn't out there every day denouncing, I can't believe Donald Trump did this with the Texas, he's supporting this case in Texas or whatever. And to me, I think Biden is a better politician than people give him credit for. I mean, he's not not great on Twitter. He's not great at sort of seizing the spotlight. But in this case, it seems like Biden and his people calculated that if Biden was out there every day bashing Trump, it would make it seem more like an issue with two sides. And maybe push Republicans to feel like they should, I can't agree with Joe Biden. I should have to take Trump's side instead of just standing back and saying, there's, Trump's just flailing around. He lost. There's no reality to debate here. Let's just move on. That worked. I'm not to say that, Biden could have been sure at the beginning that it worked. It depended on people like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia and some other people like taking a stand and standing up to Trump. But I think Biden, like I said, I think he's a better politician than we give him credit for. And I think in this case, his strategy of making it seem like it wasn't Biden versus Trump, but rather Trump versus democracy, Trump versus reality, that seemed to have worked.
Well, it certainly seems to be effective and probably good for the nation that we're not in a he said thing on that, which is the topic of another question that someone asked, and that is to ask you to address this sort of ongoing and pervasive asymmetry that seems to still be prevalent in a lot of journalism of, with where one side is simply making it up out of thin air and the other side is working with reality. Is there, clearly there's been some improvement. I think anyone would look at the reality of journalism now and say, yeah, things are better. But do you think that we're where we need to be?
Well, as I said, I think the last 6 weeks have shown you that we've adapted. I'm not sure we've adapted as far as we need to be, but we've adapted to Trump in the way that we handled his baseless charges that he didn't lose the election. I mean, and part of that I think is just ignoring him sometimes, not giving him the prominence. One of the things I was really interested in the last couple of weeks is, as I was covering these attempts by Trump to subvert the election, to go to the WashingtonPost.com and to go to the New York Times and look at just the placement of stories. How did those stories place? Trump's efforts to overturn the election, they were always under the vaccine story, always under the COVID death toll story. Like there was a decision made, which I thought was the right one, to play up those, this horrible pandemic that's happening and the things that are happening as a result of it, over this thing that Trump was doing that was going to have no consequence. But I'm not sure that's a decision you would have made before Trump, right? The president is making these allegations that he lost the election. The president is calling that he won the election. The president is calling on the Supreme Court to overturn the election. That would have been the biggest story in the world before Trump. And now everybody's recognized that part of covering Trump is recognizing the limits of his influence and how often he says things that just don't matter. And that covering them and telling people about them, making them the top story on the website is only going to confuse people more. It's not serving the goal of the truth when we are spreading as a falsehood. So I think we've gotten better at that. But it's, like I said, it's taken us a long time. And now the questions we talked about earlier is not how do we adapt to Trump, it's how do we adapt to Biden, and then also how do we deal with, how do we handle the people that went along with Trump's falsehoods and are still here, now may try to pretend like they didn't go along.
Well, we still have a majority of a political party, at least the office holders, who are behaving and talking like the soon-to-be ex-president. So that will be an ongoing thing. Question that in our Q&A here in Zoom from Liz is asking about the rise and expanded influence of media entities that take a side, and that and let's leave aside for a second whether they're just taking a side with people who lie. But that partisan media are in the ascendance, and her question was about differentiating journalism from advocacy journalism. I'm not sure they're totally separate, but how hard is that going to be to do when a lot of what people seem to want is partisan and advocacy news?
Well, I mean, from what we can do, what we at the Washington Post can do, I think, is a couple of things. One is not to confuse people ourselves, to be careful about, making clear when what you're reading is opinion and what you're reading is news. And it's, obviously it's quite easy to write a take that will get a huge number of clicks, but by blending news and opinion. But we should be clear when people read something in the Washington Post that they understand when they're reading somebody's opinion, when they're reading the news. So I think that's sort of the first thing. And then when we do write news, I think it's important to think about readers that are coming to us for the first time. If you're a longtime OANN viewer, or you're somebody who's lost in a partisan media bubble and somehow you end up at the Washington Post, how do we write our story so that that person stays, and they understand the value of what we're doing. They understand how hard we work to get the truth, and how hard we are, working to tell you as much as we know. And we're not, we didn't come into this with some preconceived notion of what the news ought to be, but we're just telling you what we know. So I think that's both the way we write the stories, and sometimes I was on this really interesting panel with the Center for Media Engagement at the University of Texas. They think a lot about, like, how do you get people to trust news? What can you put as a sidebar? What can you put in the story? What are things that we think are obvious about how we reported the story and what we did to make sure it was right, that other people who don't read us regularly don't know? So, how do we make sure we do something that when you come to us out of your bubble and find us, that we hold on to you and show you the value of what we do? I think that requires a bit of thinking about how we package the stories we write.
You're muted, Dan.
I was muted, sorry. You've largely just answered a question from Mark in our Q&A about the role of journalism in educating people about how the news works, how journalism works. And as you know, that's a lot of the focus of what we do, is to encourage people to be transparent about stuff, and something you've done pretty consistently along the way.
Social media is good for that. I mean, I think I was surprised at the degree to which people are interested in how hard you're trying, the sort of mechanics of journalism. People are interested in that stuff. And I think it builds trust if they see how hard you're working.
What's your sense of people's understanding going in? I don't know. I was a journalist for a really long time, and I've been sort of close observer of it. I still don't know what the difference is between an analysis and a commentary and an opinion, or a feature. I mean, analysis is the one that kind of makes me crazy, but
Yes.
how can we label stuff better and be really clear on what we're talking about?
I mean, so the first thing I should say is that I have studiously avoided any management responsibilities in my career. I've never managed anyone. I don't want to be in charge of anybody. Like, being in charge of myself is hard enough. So this is me just throwing stones here. I have not ever tried to manage this process, but I feel like one of the things that we could give that would help readers is a little simplicity, right? You're right that we create these things, commentaries, analyses. We have something called the debrief. These are things where they're designed to let reporters who have expertise in a topic just talk, just tell you what they know, and not have it be written in the just sort of like quote, transition, quote format of a news story. And I think in our minds, we understand the difference, or sort of understand the difference between them, and we think readers do too. But I think there's a whole, especially now when we are, we've moved beyond our traditional print audience to a much larger audience. That's great in a lot of ways, but you lose two things. One, you lose people's longtime familiarity with the Post, or the news outlet. These are people who have never read us before and may read other things that in typography and layout look like us, but don't have any of the same values. And you also lose the physical geography of the paper, where you put all the opinion columns in one place. And the sports column had some guy's picture at the top and ran down the side of C1. Like those markers, which I think help people differentiate between what kind of story it is and what to expect, are harder to find and sometimes missing in the web. And I think the answer might be to just have less gradations, to be more clear about what we're giving people. And sometimes it may sound dumb, like, oh, obviously people know we called all these people. Obviously people know this is how we, but I don't think for a lot of people that is obvious. And those are the people we want, those are the new subscribers we want to reach.
Well, you're definitely talking our language on that. And I know when I had a column, and I would hear from people say, how dare you, say that stuff? That's not journalism. I say, well, I write an opinion column. And they say, but you're not on the editorial page. And I'd never really had a great answer to people who said, you're not doing what I think you should do. It's a question.
The marker with all this was like, if there's somebody's picture at the top, then it's a column. But that now our pictures are in every story in some places.
Yeah, but I don't even know why that automatically meant that it was an opinion in the first place.
Totally.
Your picture there, so. The
guy
on TV, his pictures there.
The New York Times puts pictures of the reporter on every story, on news stories. So that even that marker, to the degree that it ever worked, is gone.
The bios at the end of stories now, in all basically everybody's doing it now. I think that's been a big improvement because it shows that there's a human being.
Yes,
involved.
Definitely.
Yeah. I'm going to find it.
While you're looking for another question, I'm just going to mention to the audience, we have about 12 minutes left in this session. So if you have questions to type into the Q&A, please do, because we want to try to answer as many questions we have, and thanks to those who already have done that.
Here's one from Twitter. James asks, is there an age shift going on now in journalism? I think the basic question is, when are the baby boomers going to leave? Please leave.
Well, at the Post, there was this era of I started the Post in the year 2000, and so many of the people who were the big time reporters then and the most experienced people left because they were the highest paid and the closest to retirement. And we had waves and waves of buyouts when the paper wasn't doing well financially. And they were the ones that took the buyouts and left. So, that was not a planned thing or a good thing, but we lost a lot of that experience. To me, the interesting transition that you see now, and is not explicitly about age, but about experience with Washington, right? There are people who have covered Washington since the 90s or since the 2000s who have this, I think, who came into Trump with this idea that the Trump era began with this idea for them, with this idea that the people change, the names change, but the dynamics of Washington don't change and shouldn't change. That people were always things were always gonna turn out all right, no matter who was in charge, that everybody was kind of alike and they all wanted to bring pork back to their districts, that, that things would turn out because they always had. And I think in their minds, that's how Washington worked. But I think really, they had been observing one of the least tumultuous eras in Washington history, from 1980 to 2000. That was an era where there was a lot of, bipartisan cooperation relatively. There was there was people, congressmen and senators knew each other. They socialized together. That thing that they had seen was actually just like an anomaly. And so they weren't ready, I think, for Trump. It took them a long time to grasp that Trump was just blowing all that up. And some people wanted him to blow that up. And now I think there's a transition to reporters who have only known the Trump era, who have only really covered the era when Trump was a candidate or Trump was president. And for them, that's the expectation they bring into the Biden era. It'll be so interesting to see if Biden brings us back to the 90s, like maybe that experience with that Washington will be helpful again. But if I was the boss, and again, I never want to be anyone's boss, I think being a political reporter is something you should do for a little while and go do something else. Because I think otherwise, if you cover politics too long, you start to think that politics should be a certain way and will always be a certain way. And I think you sometimes miss big changes that are happening slowly around you.
Yeah. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to ask a question that appears to be from one of our students, asking you for advice to journalism students on reader engagement. What do you think people going into this should do to really have these kinds of deeper conversations and collaborations with the people who are the former audience, is what I call them? And what's your best advice on this?
I'd say three things. One, social media is great for this, but it has to be the only thing you do with your social media has to be your job. Like it has to be building your audience, talking about your stories, talking about your reporting should be the main thing you do. If you're going to use social media as a tool to engage your audience, it is a tool of your professional identity. And nobody wants to hear your opinions about Star Wars. Like a few times that I've given out my opinions about baseball or Star Wars, nobody cares. And so be disabused of that idea. Nobody cares. And also you should, when you write for that audience, you're not writing for the other people who are engaging with you on Twitter all day. You're writing for a bunch of people who just want to follow the news. That's what they come to you for. And so to remember that, don't drive those people away with your opinions about pop culture or whatever. Like you've given that up. You're speaking to your audience about the things that you do professionally. So that's one. Number two, let them into your process as much as you can. Obviously, you don't want to, put out things that you haven't, tweet out things you haven't proven yet. But let people understand the things that you're looking for, the things you haven't found yet, the questions that you have, the work that you're doing. Here's how hard I work today to try to reach these people. Here's who I'm trying to reach. Here's what I want to know. Tell them the things you are trying to find out, both because they might help you, but also just because people are interested, right? That you're creating little cliffhangers. And I wonder if he's ever going to figure out this or that. Like, people, when they come back to your feed, they can see progress, which I think that's really important. You have to show people that you're trying, and that if they come back later, they will have seen you've made some small success. And the last thing is that if you're gonna ask for help, which I recommend doing, I think it works. You need to be able to demonstrate to readers that you have done everything on your power as a reporter. You've pushed it as far as your normal reporting tools will go. You're not asking for help as the first step. You've gone as far as you can, and now you're stuck, and you're asking for help. But that helps in two ways. One, it builds their trust that you're not just wasting their time, and also it narrows down what you're asking for. The narrower you can get your ask to be, the more likely you're going to get people who really know. So I would say those things, but it's very, very valuable, but it requires a certain kind of persona on social media that is always focused on the reporting and the work you're doing, rather than anything else.
That's incredibly useful for, I think, our next generation. There's an anonymous attendee question. I should ask you about anonymous sources, but I'll ask the question that they ask. How has the Post changed and evolved since Jeff bought the company? Apart from getting bigger.
Well, I mean, we didn't know what to expect when Jeff Bezos bought the company. We had, that was a total surprise to us that this had happened. And, the things that we knew about Bezos were based on stories about Amazon. What's it like to be a worker at Amazon? And we thought that the culture of the Post might really change. And I have to say, it really hasn't. The cultural, the culture of the Post and the newsroom, how it works, how we approach the news is really about Marty Barron, our editor, much more than Bezos. Bezos has come to the newsroom a few times. I've met him a couple times. And what he says when he's there is like, keep kicking butt, do great, go, have great ambitions and follow them. He doesn't tell us anything more than that. The thing that has really changed, I think, has been a focus on, and I don't know how much of this is Jeff versus Marty or people, but in between them, is it a focus on the technology of the paper? Like we were just before, I think we hadn't really put technology first. And there were simple things like how long it took our web page to load, the milliseconds it takes the web page to load. Solving those things at first, and then being really ruthless in how we thought about what audiences wanted. I think that's probably been the biggest change in the last 6 years is like in 2013 or 2014, the idea that people might see metrics of how many people clicked your story. We were all like, oh, that's horrible. They'd make us look at these clicks and figure out whose story was read more. It's just one step toward clickbait. Like the idea that a reporter should know how many people read their story was like, that's horrible. Now that's a big part of what we do, because why do we write if not to be read, right? I mean, it doesn't mean you have to write clickbait all the time, but to think about what works well, what people want to read, and then giving people more of that thing, as long as what we think we're producing is valuable, it's great to know that. I would want to know that. And it showed us that we were probably shoveling a lot of stuff out there that we thought was great that nobody read. I think that focus on, writing things that people want to read and writing our stories in ways that people will engage with, that's great. And I think that's something that's changed in the Bezos era. I don't know if it's his influence directly or just the people he brought in.
I think the Amazon relentless customer focus sounds like
that's good.
I mean, talking about. Yeah.
I think the idea of us serving customers and thinking that we should do things that our readers wanted was like kind of laughably absent when I started in the business. Like, how dare they tell us what readers want to read? We're going to give it to them whether they like it or not. I think it's great to put their needs, in front of us, to understand what they want.
How are we doing on time? We're 3 minutes. I'm going to do the question that all good reporters ask at the end of interviews, which is, what question didn't we get to that we should have, and what's the answer?
Oh, that is a good question. I think one of the key things from me, somebody who's covered the Trump organization and Trump's conflicts of interest for 4 years, is what role will Donald Trump play in our politics next year and the year after that? And to what degree will there still be accountability reporting, or should there still be accountability reporting about his business and him? We're struggling to plan for 2021 now, and that's one thing we're really trying to figure out, like how much more will we want to write about him and his business and what he did? How much legal trouble will he be in? We'll have to write about. Basically, in September of next year, how much will Donald Trump matter, and how much will people want to, will we need to sort of continue having accountability about what Donald Trump is doing? That is just so hard to predict. I'm not sure even he knows. But that's one thing I'm struggling with now, is like when I plan my future, I've spent the last 5 years writing about this one person, and writing in a way, and so much of the social media following I've had and the success I've had through social media is based on the fact that this one person has so much attention on them. When we transition to a different era where he's probably not going to be that important, how do we adapt, and how do we, take the same, try to keep some of that focus and put it on whatever we think is important next?
Yeah, I think we've all been injecting Donald Trump into our bloodstreams for a long time, and maybe it'll be nice to not do so much of that. But
it'll be different, definitely.
To those who have to live in it as a profession, all I can say is thoughts and prayers. Listen, it is really great to have had you here. We're at the end of our hour, and I know it's the end of the day there. So thank you again. And on behalf of my colleagues, Christy and Celeste, and our collected folks who joined us today, it's a joy to see you, as always. And we'll see you in the new year, I trust.
Yes. Thank you again for having me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Happy holidays. Happy New Year.
You too.
Bye. Thanks everyone for joining us.